history, babe.
Welcome to the podcast. I'm Ginny.
I'm Natalie, and we are the Art History Babes. And we are joined today
by multiple friends.
So many friends.
Zach.
Great start.
Oh.
I also have a pocket knife in my hand.
Comfort objects.
As soon as we started recording, my video just cut out. So I didn't hear or see anything that got started until you all laughed and said Zach. What I missed, but now we're back.
Oh, it's good. It's good.
Real professional operation we have here. Is it a surprise the show is 3 months behind schedule? I don't know.
No.
I appreciate that you guys stuck to our brand.
Yeah, right? Yeah, so we're the Art History Babes. That's the amazing Zach Clark from National Monuments Press. Zach and I have been curating a show called Virtual Realism, and we are finally reaching the kind of end of the show, and that everything is curated and that we have things put together, and now we're doing episodes where we're talking to some of the artists from Virtual Realism. And so today we're joined by Anna and Connor, who are both featured in Virtual Realism. So thank you both so much for joining us. And we're going to get into like both of your individual practices and everything. And we're very excited to have this time to just talk to you about art, talk to you about your work and the show and all that good stuff.
Excited to be here.
Thank you.
Yeah, same. I love the podcast and love working with Zach. So looking forward to it.
Yeah. So I think how I would love to start is just have each of you kind of talk a little bit about yourselves in terms of like what your background is, a little bit about your work, and then we'll kind of get more into the specifics of your particular works in the show. But Connor, let's start with you.
Yeah, hey y'all, my name's Connor Czora. I'm a 24-year-old artist from upstate New York, currently living and working in Washington, D.C. My practice is rooted in ceramics, and I'm really interested in the relationships between sort of imperial ceramics, cultural taste, and socio-political power structures in the United States.
Yes, so fun, so good. Can't wait to talk about your work for this show more. It's so good. And Anna.
Hi, yeah. So I am an artist. I lived in the Bay Area for a long time, but I recently moved to Albuquerque for grad school. So I'll be pursuing my MFA at the University of New Mexico. And my background is mainly in photography, though I really like to kind of mix it with installation and try alternative printing processes. And I think a lot about like memory and perception, and also dabble in political work too, especially over the past few years. So that's kind of the work that I submitted to this show, is sort of in that, all of those areas, I guess.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so that actually was why. So for all of these episodes that we're doing, we're pairing artists together, and through sort of connections that we see or know in the work. And so with both of your work, they're both work that is politically inspired, but not necessarily the most traditional approaches to making political work. I would say that Connor, your piece with the Make America Great Again hat is on the more overt side of things, but your ceramic pieces, they're a piece of Americana. There's a craft and folk art side to it, so it's a much more kind of subtle approach. I think Anna and I, a crit group that we're in together, we talk about soft activism a lot. And I think that both of your work falls into this area of like a soft political activism. Not that it's soft in content, but it's a more it's softer approach that ends up being more inviting, I think, to some people who may not want to see political work because they're turned off by that for some reason. So so that's a really long buildup to ask. Seeing that politics is both part of your work, but in that more subtle way, do either of you like have anything you want to say about that sort of approach, and what makes you want to make work that obviously is making a statement, but in that more nuanced, subtle way?
Yeah, I mean, I think I just find it's more interesting and kind of because it's part of a process for me to kind of like when I'm making work like that, I think I'm trying to figure out something that I'm thinking or like I have thoughts about it, but it's not fully resolved. And the process of doing that kind of gets me to realize what my like thoughts are. It's more based in emotion. And I think it being less, I don't know, everyone has different emotions and different feelings. And I guess I want it to resonate with people on multiple levels. So as I do for me. So I'd rather have it be like inviting or kind of have like a little questionable side to it that's intriguing to people, and then kind of break down the layers from there. Or maybe you might not necessarily know that it's about something dark or political until you kind of like read about it or like look closer or spend time with it.
I feel that with my soul. That's like part of the root of my practice, I feel. For me, some of it comes from my background. So where I grew up in upstate New York, I grew up in a sort of small conservative town outside of Rochester. And so I was like conservative through like early high school until I like started expanding my view of the world. But sort of what I noticed from that in just the conversations I was having with my family as like my viewpoints were changing over time, and with other people, is that when you can frame something in a lens that people are already a little bit more open to, I feel like it opens up a dialogue in a way that if it were to be completely just upfront and in your face with something, people are less receptive to it. So for me, I think part of it is using sort of the seductiveness of ceramic and the sort of shiny material and the gold and the porcelain, like really draw folks in, and then sort of confront them with the contents of the piece after they're already invested in it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I notice that sort of quality in both of your work, especially in the show, where it does have that, both of your work has that initial like very alluring aspect, visual aspect of it, where it's like, Anna, you have like these flowers, you know, like people are naturally drawn to like that kind of organic bright color. And Connor, with your work, you know, like you just said, it's shiny, it's ceramic, you know, it pulls you in this seemingly initially kind of almost decorative way, but there's a lot more substance that is after that initial kind of interaction with your work, which kind of feeds into talking more specifically about what you chose to include in the show, and would love to just hear more from the two of you about the body of work that's in virtual realism specifically, and kind of what you were thinking about while you were making it, and why you wanted to include it in the show.
Yeah, so I submitted this series of floral arrangements that look sort of drippy and kind of abstract. And I can talk a little bit about the process too, but I had been thinking about like the cultural situation. I think it started in like 2018 around the time of the Parkland shooting, which happened on Valentine's Day. So I was thinking about like the transaction of giving flowers and then these kind of like empty gestures that politicians were saying in response. And not just that one scenario, but like this is years and years of shootings and just inappropriate response to trauma that happens in our country. So, you know, they'd say like, oh, the families are in our thoughts and prayers, like thinking of you. And just, I was thinking a lot about like, that's so empty. So I started taking these like screen grabs of floral arrangements from sites like Amazon or just like big corporate floral companies that you can get an arrangement from and send it anywhere. And it's funny because they actually all look the same. So like if you go and just Google search floral arrangements, like somehow the same orange arrangement is on all these websites. And like no one is actually taking the time to pick flowers from their region or like even put time into creating it. Like it's just this cookie cutter arrangement that can really go anywhere. And I don't know, just I started thinking about like the transactional side of it and like how deeply rooted capitalism is and like consumerism in our country, even in these really like emotional, traumatic spaces that, so I printed them out onto this paper that actually is like a synthetic plastic, and it resists the ink. So the process kind of forced me to spend time with it and really like put my own like physical work into the pieces. So I would hang them on the wall or like blow into them or hang them in different directions or lay them like on the floor of my studio and they'd have to sit there for a long time as they dry. So kind of like for me, it felt kind of like that was a way to be ceremonial or like spend time with this traumatic experience. But I mean, there's also some kind of humor to it because it's like they look like pop art and like pretty and beautiful. And I don't know, I guess like it's also kind of a way of dealing.
For sure. For sure.
For me, the piece that I originally picked was I call it Trenton Vase Pandemic. And it's like maybe a 2-foot tall vase. But what I was looking at with this is challenging American exceptionalism. So a lot of my work is sort of rooted in taking a look at how do we project ourselves as a country to the rest of the world? What do we say that our ideals and values are as compared to what do we see in reality? Like, what is it like on the ground, right? And so the vase that I submitted is sort of referencing a vase from 1904 that was created by the Trenton Potteries Company up in New Jersey for the World Fair down in Louisiana. And the Trenton vase was created basically as this piece that was supposed to represent, you know, this is what America is to the rest of the world, right? So on the original, it was black and it's got in the main sort of frame, the scene is Washington crossing the Delaware. Very typical.
Yeah.
Haven't seen that before. But sort of like projecting like all of this grandeur and like, this is what we are. And I was working on a series of these, which is ongoing. But when I was working on this first one, the pandemic hit, right? March of last year. And so I had to take a break and went home to see my family in Michigan. And I couldn't work because I didn't have access to my ceramic studio. But while I was there, the things that I was noticing is that kind of typical of America, but I feel like a lot of these values that we profess were like really turning around and biting us back in these strange ways. So specifically, right, the idea of like personal liberty or freedom, I think is something that over the course of 200, 300 years, right, has twisted from this original idea of like freedom from oppression into the freedom to do whatever I want, regardless of the consequences for others, right? And sort of thinking about that as an American ideal that we really project outward. And also, like, you know, talking about the virtual realism response to socialist realism, a lot of my work too, I'm interested in looking at historic political artworks, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
With socialist realism, right, they're looking at trying to project a very specific narrative of what it is that the USSR is doing, or whatever the respective country is doing. And for me, I wanted to project a sort of vision that I was seeing, not just from my own experiences, but from many perspectives that I had seen throughout the pandemic. So the images that I used on the face are collaged with different photographs from media coverage of the pandemic. And so there's like a sort of A side and B side. One of the sides is really dealing with anti-mask protests as sort of a focus, right? This idea, again, that my freedom is worth more than the common good, essentially. And it was interesting doing that too, because the side with those protesters, I used one of the images was from protesters outside of the Michigan State Capitol. So this kind of made national news at the time, but it wasn't as big of a thing. But basically, months before January 6th happened, a whole bunch of far-right protesters in Michigan stormed the state capitol with firearms and got into the building and were just like running around with these like massive rifles and stuff.
Yeah.
Again, just protesting for their freedom to not put a cloth over your face. Like, seriously?
Yeah.
I'm starting to ramble, but
no, this is great. Ramble away. We ramble all the time.
Yes.
Beautiful. Yeah, so I was interested in basically, right, framing a multiplicity of perspectives, like getting not just one viewpoint, but a sort of collective viewpoint and saying, like, this is what America is in reality, right? Projecting this is the country as it actually is, regardless of the ideals that we are projecting ourselves to be.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, and what a time to already be thinking about those things and then just have it all really dialed up in kind of the public space in the last year and a half, where we're just like that those kinds of dichotomies are constantly in our visual spheres. Yeah.
How do I phrase what I want to say? I think that another, I'm speaking to a small collection of pieces that is here within our show, but you both, going back to that soft activism that I was talking about, also have a destructive streak in your work, which I think is also something that's interesting, that they are these, more approachable works, but there is also this like inherent violence in them that I think is fairly interesting. And so, I'd be curious to hear where that comes from, and from really, photography and clay, we're kind of polar ends of material spectrum with those two aspects. And so, Connor, you're working with an inherently breakable thing. There's a fragility to the work that you're working with. And so I'm curious how much that aspect of destruction is something you're thinking about, and that aspect of fragility that you're thinking about. And then similarly, Anna, you're working in a medium that is famously eternally reproducible. We're reprinting work from people who have passed on years ago. So there is a sort of timelessness that, but you've also found a way to be destructive with a something on the other end of the spectrum that is almost unbreakable. And so kind of where that aspect of destruction and entropy kind of works its way into the way you're thinking about a lot of your work. These compound questions are huge. Sorry.
No worries.
Yeah, I mean, I think about that a lot and kind of try to challenge like what the idea of a photograph is. I mean, for a long time, a photograph was supposed to be like a symbol of truth, or like this moment actually happened or it was capturing something in reality. But I think that idea is kind of like long gone. And I really like to play with that. In this case, like with the floral arrangements, I don't think it's quite as obvious, but the process around doing that, like taking this image from online that's really recognizable, and then I'll manipulate it in Photoshop and kind of like adjust the scale of some of the flowers and make the colors more extreme or saturated. And I'm kind of interested in this, like where beauty and like the grotesque overlaps, and like it can kind of be both. So yeah, and then I think just by printing them in the way that I do, like bringing something digital back into analog space and kind of like physically manipulating the ink, and yeah, like deconstructing it, or like sometimes like pouring other materials onto it. And there's something about like physically altering an image that feels really satisfying to me and almost therapeutic. So yeah, it is kind of violent and but like also empowering in a way, because
Sure.
whoever captured the initial photograph, I mean, in this sense, it's not as like high risk. It's just a photo of flowers. But like Connor was talking about media images, like a lot of my other work, I pull from media images and kind of question, like it usually starts with either rage or like a like pretty serious emotion, and processing that emotion through the manipulation of it, and then kind of living with it for a long time as it like dries in the studio and thinking about it like years later. I'm curious to see like how my mind feels in the moment, and then like 2 years from now or 10 years from now, like will it carry the same feeling?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, what you said, like the rage is kind of being a fuel, like in the creation of the work, is something that we have in common. Just, when you're dealing with social and political topics like that, especially, the past couple of years we've been making work under Trump, there's so much just like rage that has been building up. And for me, part of that is I want to find a creative, productive way to use that rage to try to do something better. With Anna, what you were saying too with your images, you might agree, but I feel like I like to think of destruction almost as an act of creation as well. Like it's got this sort of duality to it.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Like y'all have talked about iconoclasm before, but I think like a lot of artistic processes really involve like taking things and cutting them up and mashing them together, right?
Yeah.
In my work, I like to do a lot of photo collage. And Anna, from the photos that I've seen of yours, it seems like you do too, right? But like breaking down those images and then building them back up into something else, I think is just inherent to the process of creation. I know for me with ceramics, that fragility and that destruction is also something that is just inherent in the material, right? So if we're looking at the sort of mega hat, that was an ongoing project. I started back in 2018, and it started as an assignment when I was in college, where I don't even remember what it was for. I think it was for a ceramic casting class, which casting ceramics, that's an industrial technique. So if you're going to Target, you're buying bowls, they're probably cast. You use a mold made out of plaster, you pour in liquid slip, which is a liquid form of clay, and it replicates the shape of that object. And, given 2018 was already a full year at least of Trump, which was plenty of time for rage to build up. And so what I was looking at is trying to find a way that I could sort of break or deconstruct the symbol of, right, those red MAGA hats that for me were like the epitome, like the icon of all of the hatred towards minorities, towards women, towards LGBT folks that Trump had sort of inspired and revved up in people. And so for me, I was thinking a lot about iconoclasm as a process of like, right, breaking that symbol metaphorically, but also physically, right? Um, I also like to think a lot. I really like Ai Weiwei. Um,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
know y'all do. He's got
Yeah.
the piece of him dropping the Han Dynasty urn,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Um, it's one of my favorites. But right, like taking a look at these historical objects that, even if it's something so simple or so common, like a MAGA hat, right? Those are, unfortunately, were fairly common.
Mhm.
And taking that and breaking it, for me, was an expression of sort of, again, like breaking down um, almost all of that hatred and violence and saying, enough is enough. Um,
Yeah.
and I think, so I did the performance 3 times. First time was outside of the White House. Second time was outside of the Capitol building when he was impeached the first time. And then the last time was in front of the White House again on election night.
Mm.
But every time, something that I've noticed is I tend to do it when there are crowds of people around. And I haven't ever really documented the process, but part of that piece is sweeping up the remains after, right? So it's not just about an act of destruction. Again, it's sort of this destruction as a process of creation, and then the aftercare, right?
Yes.
Tending to the healing and the cleaning up, the restructuring and resettling that is left in the wake of this violence, I think is something that's inherent both in the process of creation, but especially with political work, right? If you're
Mhm.
doing political critique, I think it's important too um, to think about solutions and positive things that we can sort of put forward as ways to move forward and move on.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I mean, I think so much about destruction as being, on its surface viewed as something violent, which it certainly can be. But Connor, like you talking about iconoclasm and the way that symbols, especially political symbols, can be destroyed and then kind of restructured in order to make some room for something new. And I think a lot about, like the iconoclasm during like the French Revolution and how you have a lot of imagery of things getting destroyed, which in a weird way like commemorates that act of destruction, but then also like imagery of new things getting built and how like that whole kind of progression is recorded. And I think it's especially interesting like that you were breaking these because you're in DC. So you're literally right there at kind of at the center of where Trump reigned. And even just like talking about making art under Trump, like I never really, and I'm curious how both of you feel about this, because I never really used to view things as like, oh, making or creating something under someone, but that kind of verbiage is very also much in line with kind of the bigger theme of virtual realism and socialist realism as being a very propaganda driven art movement, because it was made during a time in which the political powers that be were incredibly pervasive in people's everyday lives and controlled a lot of aspects of people's everyday lives. And I'm curious if, since Trump, the two of you have kind of felt that connection previously, like, or do you think it became more heightened where like your art was more in a response to like political happenings in our country and kind of using that like rage that you felt, like if that really felt like it I feel like I'm asking a question I know the answer to, because I was like, did that impact your work? Obviously it did, but I think
So how did it impact your work?
yeah, I mean it's more of like this looking at our country in a way of being impacted by political powers that be, and like the ways in which that feels like it's been more intense over the last few years. So there's not necessarily a question in that. But it's because obviously both of you are very mindful of the politics in our country. And but I'm curious, I suppose here's a question. Here we go. I got there. Since Trump has been out of office and kind of in the sphere that we're at now, like, do you feel that your work has changed in terms of what you're focusing on now, what you're working on now, what you're thinking about now compared to like even a year ago, or are a lot of the themes still fairly consistent in your mind? Whew, that was a lot of words. I'm sorry.
I do feel like there was a sense of relief when he was out of office and kind of had to like, I don't know, rethink about, it's almost like PTSD or something. Like I was like, do I still have to be so urgently responding in this way? And I think that's what the first part of your question, during those like 4 years, I think I've always like had criticisms or questions, but it felt really urgent during that time. And also like, I think being someone who has like a significant amount of privilege, I felt like I really need to say something now and kind of use my privilege in that way. And like, I'm lucky in the sense that I didn't have as much at risk if I were to be extra vocal. And that's something that I just don't want to take for granted. But now, yeah, I kind of feel like coming out of that time, I am like more interested in other things. And I think like some of them are still political, but not necessarily directly linked to an individual or like a movement. Although it's kind of scary because it's not gone, and that's something that I question. And like, maybe it's just, I need to be more involved, or I need to be paying attention better. And I'm kind of like letting it go right now, which I shouldn't be.
I feel that.
Yeah, I feel really similarly. I mean, you know, I'm white, so also coming from a position of privilege too. But especially with Trump in office, I think the urgency was one of the main shifts that I noticed in my own work. Because prior to then, I was still like engaging with some of these social themes, doing stuff about LGBTQ rights, stuff like that. But it was one of those things like, I still remember election night, like you say, PTSD, like it's one of those things I remember exactly where I was, what I was doing. I remember my partner at the time and I crying ourselves to sleep because we were so uncertain of the future that was ahead of us. And I think there's something to be said about the culture that an individual can bring and can change within the country. Like with Trump specifically, it was such a cult of personality specifically, but the way that he sort of shifted the way that we think as a society, right? I mean, the social media sort of just frenzies feel like they really, really ramped up during that time. I think there was a general chaos or feeling of chaos during that time, because it was one of those things where you wake up every day and you're like, oh, like now he's making fun of, you know, Kim over in Korea. Like,
yeah,
maybe we shouldn't do that. And so I think after Trump left office, at least for me, there's been sort of some continuation and some change. The biggest change that I've noticed is that I don't feel that same like instinctive urgency and like deep like sense of fear and dread that I think a lot of us lived with for the past couple of years. But Anna, like you were saying, you know, looking around, unfortunately, there's still so much work to be done. And so for me, I'm still sort of looking at a lot of these same themes, whether it's dealing with things like white supremacy, gender discrimination, you know, militarism, things like that. But I think I may be approaching it in a slightly more quiet way now. So like the first piece that I made, like after Trump left office, I guess was still kind of related to Trump. but it was responding to the January 6th protests in DC, right? Uh, because I remember I was sitting in my studio up in Northeast DC, and I was just, working on my stuff, and a studio mate, Brittany, was talking to her husband, and she goes, "Oh, they just broke into the Capitol." And I wasn't part of that conversation, but I had to stop. I was like, "Wait, what do you mean?"
Yeah.
And I turned on my laptop, and, blocks away, they're trying to overthrow the government.
Mm.
And it, for me, was this really weird feeling of like feeling extremely threatened, right? Because there's violence going on blocks away.
Yeah.
But it was also this really unnerving quiet that was taking place because we were at the studio. So even though it was happening, blocks away, this attempted overthrow of the government was something that we were personally dealing with quietly. And, I think about Amanda Gorman's really wonderful poem that she recited at the inauguration. But the one line that I put, sort of inscribing all of the pieces in this dinner set is "Quiet isn't always peace." And I think about that a lot because even more generally, right, I think politically there's been a lot more sort of calm lately, a little more quiet. It's not daily, like, here's the next existential threat. Although, granted, with climate change, we could talk about that. But, I think we're still dealing with a lot of these issues, but for me, it's in a bit more of a quiet way, a bit more sensitive of an approach.
Yeah, totally.
I have a alternate isn't quite the word I want to use, but that's what I'm going to use. But also maybe more generous to America take. I'm gonna work this thought out as I say it all. Of the like, I have several more years on a lot of you. And so like I was an adult during Bush. And so like for me, I definitely know a lot of my, like, especially I was in a band on tour during George W. Bush. And so during when bands were doing protests about how terrible Bush was, and there was a similar energy of a vilification of Bush. Obviously not to the extent that we had with Trump, but I think that that was there. And then we kind of had this, Obama got elected and we all did a sigh of relief and thought that everything was fine. And I think that made that generation of folks, a handful of them, not feel the urgency. But I think that there's a handful of folks that I think, especially folks in their later 30s, 40s, 50s, that they still seem very pissed off because they learned last time not to let their guard up when they thought that somebody on their team was coming into office. Because even if we think back to Obama, like Obama was pro-gay marriage at first, or anti-gay marriage at first. So like there was still a lot of leaps that had to happen, even when somebody who was, from the left was in office. And I think that had a bit of a hardening is not the word I want to use, but I think that a handful of people on the left have learned to keep fighting, which I think is something that I'm seeing in people who are slightly younger that are like upset that Biden hasn't done away with student loan debt yet. And it's like, that's one, that is never going to happen. Two, like it doesn't happen in 6 months when a pandemic and climate change in Afghanistan's happening. And so I don't know, that's a thing I'm thinking about of how I feel like there's still a certain amount of fight that is still built up in a lot of people, or people that are still having a lot of expectation that things need to happen really quickly. But then to make my more generous take that I was thinking about when y'all were talking was that, like, do we give Trump too much credit? Like, we obviously Trump hardened and radicalized a certain section of the right, for sure. But are we giving Trump too much credit that he's responsible for why so many of us on the left felt called to action? Or in the previous years, have Americans become more aware and more accepting than maybe pop culture led us to believe? And so somebody who was being more outwardly discriminate caused a lot of people to go, wait, I'm not okay with that. Like, if we see how like white suburban voters changed, like, did they change their votes because Trump offended them that much, or because it made them come to terms with the fact that, wait, I don't agree with this thing that I thought was the culture that I was connected to had agreed with? Like, they needed someone to say out loud what people weren't actually saying and was just taken as like, this is part of our culture. I don't know. That was a very, very meandery thought. I don't know if it made sense.
It did make sense.
Yeah.
I mean, I think to a certain extent, Trump does get too much credit. And I think in a lot of ways, he was a figurehead for things that have already been long brewing in this country since its inception, pretty much.
Sorry for all the listeners that we have. If you have a handful of Trump supporting listeners, I think,
do you think we do?
I mean, if we do, they've listened through much more divisive conversations than that one, for sure. We have not held back, I don't think, in that department.
I was just generous, and now I'm recognizing sometimes you can be too generous. So
it's always too far to go in a direction. I like the idea of bringing in, giving him too much credit. It reminds me of like very early on in the Trump days, I found this children's book that I bought for my little brother by Michael Ian Black, comedian. And basically it's about Trump, and he makes him this like little character, and kind of the essence is that it's all smoke and mirrors, and the more attention you give him, the more he's going to feel this sense of inflation when it's really nothingness. And it still holds, I think, to this day, that like that is kind of what Trump has going for him, is he can work up a frenzy and then use that to his advantage. And he probably has a lot of people who have taught him how to do that or told him exactly what to fucking do. But never mind. Now I'm rambling. But God, it's contagious, you guys. Yeah, so I don't know. I like that concept, and we're right back where we started. So
I mean, I'm always appreciative in a weird way. Not in a weird way, but I think, especially like in the early days of Trump, I strangely was comforted by my like art historical knowledge of political times of turmoil and how creative people responded to that, and how I think artists have been at the forefront of challenging and responding to and processing a lot of issues that encompass like times of great strain, and things feel very binary and very tense. And I have always been appreciative of that. And even just like Zach, with you talking about being an adult during the Bush administration, and how that to you felt like it had a lot of that same energy, where people were pushing back against that and responding to that. And that, we have this tendency, and I think to a certain degree it's human, where you're in the thick of something that feels so intense and so bad. In this last year and a half, particularly so, but also just reminding ourselves that like, there are these ebbs and flows, and we are lucky and we are privileged to be able to express our distrust, dissatisfaction, protest, outrage at the things that are happening in our country, and do that in ways and express that in ways that feel in certain ways therapeutic. And I think just looking at both of your work and, you know, the ideas behind this show, I'm like, hey, you know, it's pretty fucking cool. Like we've all been through a very shitty time, but I love both of your work and the way all the thoughtfulness and the ideas and the feelings that you both work through to make your work. I'm just very grateful for it, and have a lot of respect for it. So thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm gonna piggyback on that because there is something just so like pleasant about both of your work, and hearing you guys talk about your process and just like how you spend time with things. And thoughtful is a great word, Jen, because like, yeah, it very much appeals to my sensitive soul, but I love that it's rage based. Like I like that it's both, because nothing is ever as simple as it appears like on face value. So I like that both of your work taps into that in terms of process, in terms of what you're actually representing with your work, and yet you make it so like visually appealing at the same time. So it's just like, it's a lovely experience. And then it's also, it feels satisfying because it's not surface level. It's all of it. Yeah, it's great to have you guys in this show that I get to watch happen. And I love all you guys for the stuff you've done. This is fun.
Aww.
This has been like the funnest being a fly on a wall kind of a conversation that I've had in a long time.
I'm glad.
Thanks.
Yeah. Well, before we wrap up, are there any parting thoughts or things either of you would like to share? I mean, you know, by now we are free rambling, talking people. So if there's anything else either of you want to touch on, by all means, feel free. And I would also ask for both of you to say where people can find you, like your Instagram, website, and all that. And then obviously once we have everything together on the website and the digital catalog and Instagram, people will be able to find you and your work. But just wanted to give you a final nod of time if you'd like it.
I just want to thank you guys for creating this space to talk about virtual realism and socialist realism. And it was interesting like researching that, because I don't know, Zach had kind of like talked about it a little bit, but I had never really considered how it is in relation to my work, or I didn't really know that much about it. So I had a lot of fun like researching it and looking at images from that time and kind of making those connections. So just thanks for the opportunity to like talk about it and kind of think in a different way. And for the show, I'm excited to see the rest of the work. And yeah, thanks.
Of course, thank you.
And same for me. Thank you all so much for including me. I'm really happy to be a part of this. It's a cool prompt to look into, especially like reinterpreting for the 21st century and where we are now. Looking at how art and culture like is shaping public thought, I think is really important. And I'm glad to be a part of the conversation. I know if y'all are interested in seeing more of my work, I have an artist website. It's connorzoraart.com. I guess we could spell it in the show notes, but CONNORCZORAART.com.
We love both of them.
Oh man, I'm gonna call you back to do some ads with me, Connor. That was beautiful.
I would love it. I'd love it. My Instagram is at connor.zora. The spelling is the same. We'll put that below.
You know it.
Yeah, thank y'all so much for having us.
Of course.
Yeah, thanks. Oh, my website is www.annarotty.com. It's ANNAROTTY. And then my Instagram is at Rotty, my name. Easy. But yeah, thank you so much. This was a great conversation.
I feel like Anna, we're doing a disservice if we have this whole conversation about political activism and you don't give a quick plug about being a poll worker, being active in elections, because this probably won't come out before the recall, but if you live in California, you're voting no. And if you didn't vote no, I don't know what's wrong with you. But Anna is a storied veteran poll worker who believes in elections very strongly. So
It's true.
give us your pitch.
Yeah, so I guess like I was gonna mention it earlier because that was kind of another way that like when all of this chaos started happening, I really felt like I needed to get involved like on the ground level too. So I started volunteering for the San Francisco Department of Elections as a poll worker in 2016, and I got obsessed with it. Like I am sad that I moved and can't be a part of it, and they're posting like photos on Instagram, and I'm really jealous that I can't be part of it this election. But yeah, I then worked as a poll worker coordinator this past election. So for 3 months, like hiring, staffing, making sure that we have poll workers who speak all the languages that are necessary for each like precinct in San Francisco. There's 588 polling places in San Francisco. So it's really cool to see like what kind of people come out and like give up their garages to be a polling place and work from like 6 a.m. to midnight helping other people vote. I just am so inspired by it that I started taking photographs of these people and also interviewing them. And Zach and I are working on a book about that. So that will come out at some point. But yeah, there's just so much to say about it. I could go on forever, but I just am really inspired by people that like do the work on the ground level. And I mean, even by voting, but just like something about the back end of like what goes into the architecture of democracy and like these spaces, and like voting is nothing without people. So it's just really inspiring to me. And hopefully I can get involved here in Albuquerque.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for your service, Anna.
Yes.
Thank you for
real.
voting. And if anyone wants to be a poll worker, we can talk.
Good to know. Good to know.
I'm
Oh,
piggybacking off of that
fun.
too.
So
Yeah.
Just
everyone vote.
piggybacking off real quick. Vote, please, but also get involved with local politics. Get involved with local groups and organizations, right?
Yeah.
Even, doing national big stuff can seem kind of scary, but, help starts at home. You can help out your local community, whether you're working community gardens, helping just redistribute food and resources to, local folks in need. There's always, help that you can do, even if it's at an individual level.
Definitely. It all helps. It all counts.
look at this great note we ended on.
I
Yeah,
know.
good. Zach,
Look at that.
From destruction to hopeful.
Exactly.
beautiful transition.
We love it.
What a delight. Well, Connor and Anna, thank you both so incredibly much. We love your work and are so happy to have you on the show. And it was great chatting with y'all.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much.
Yeah,
Thank
So great
you.
talking with you.
All right.
Okay, I'm not taking that as a challenge, Zach, and it will come out before the recall. So
Okay, vote on the
That's
recall.
editing it. So
challenge accepted.
The art history